Now, governance experts believe that there is no enabling legal framework that addresses youth participation and electoral and political processes except for voting at the age of 18. Lulu White, CEO of Elections Management and Consulting Agency of Africa, says government must address the youth unemployment crisis in order to avert a revolt. Lulu White joins me now to discuss this further. Very good afternoon to you. Thank you for your time. You're warning that government should address the youth unemployment crisis before young people revolt. We have seen young people express discontent through the fees must fall protests. Talk to us about your concerns.
Look, I think the reality is that the South African youth, and this is just basically my view and the view of all other observers in the industry, that the youth has been discontent for quite a while. The youth of South Africa has become a ticking time bomb. And any slight provocation basically is an indication that we are sitting on a ticking time bomb. And you make a great reference to the fees must fall. There's also the Arab Spring was what, was among the many young movements that actually shows that history can be altered by the youth. In July last year, during COVID-19, we saw the youth revolt. Yes, people said it was political dynamics, but mainly it was the biggest players there. It was also young people that were discontent, that started the looting, that started a whole lot of other things that happened. We are seeing it with Operation Dudula, and I know it's controversial that we actually talk about Operation Dudula or put South Africa first. All of these people that are ahead or that are leading these movements are young people. And all of them, one thing that seems to be coming across is that there's high unemployment rate. They're blaming foreigners for high unemployment rate. Corruption also being a large player in the reason why young people are not employed. So you realize that we are actually sitting on a time bomb, on a ticking time bomb. And the government needs to find a way to actually make sure that young people are able to express themselves in a manner that is progressive, so that young people do not find themselves in a situation where they end up going the route of the Arab Spring, as we have seen in Egypt a few years ago.
Yes, and youth unemployment in South Africa has now been described as stubbornly high, with young people between the ages of 15 and 24 accounting now for 66.5% of the unemployed in the fourth quarter of 2021. How do you believe that government is failing young people in South Africa?
Look, I think the government is failing young people in South Africa because, number one, there seems to be a lot of positions in government departments, right? And these government departments, they're not hiring enough young people there. The only time that young people find work within the government sector is if they are interns. And we both know with the cost of living in South Africa, internships simply do not work. They do not pay enough for these young people to be able to sustain themselves. And after they've gone through the internship system, they get into another internship system instead of them being absorbed by the youth, by the system in itself, or by the government in itself. That's the first example. Secondly, the government does not seem to have created an enabling environment together with the private sector to be able to actually hire young people. Thirdly, there is an issue also in regard to the education, the standard of education that is being given. If a person says that they attend schools at previously Model C schools that were called Model C schools versus somebody who's come from environment, a rural environment, or in the location, the level of education there is also different, and that actually has a huge impact into how young people are able to progress and have a perspective or prosperous careers in future. So there's no balance with regard to the type, the level, and the quality of education. Two, there's no communication. The government has no plan. There's no collaboration between the private sector and the public sector to ensure that there's some working relationship to ensure that opportunities for young people for employment are actually availed. And what you do see, which people have been complaining about, is you see a lot of unskilled labor jobs being taken over by foreign nationals, and that gives the obscure view that South African government is not interested in the youth.
In fact, I'd like for us to touch on the unskilled jobs a little later on, but you also made mention of the education part of it. Critics have cited that access to quality education is the only answer for dealing with these sort of matters when it comes to the high youth unemployment rate, while others say government needs to now liberalize the economy to create conditions for job creation. What is your take around that, especially considering the legal framework that needs to happen, as well as the type of balance you were making reference to?
Look, I think my view is that the government seems to always be hiding behind legislation that needs to be enabled. I don't understand why is it that when it comes to actually having or creating adequate and equitable opportunities for young people in South Africa, it has to be that difficult that people need to find, they need to create a law for it. Surely the Labour Department should have such laws already in existence. And I mean, that's why I made reference also to the fact that there's an exploitation that seems to be happening, and this is across the board, whether it's private or public sector. There's an exploitation that seems to be happening where people of a particular background, particularly in South Africa, are offered internships on internships on internships, and on these internships, doesn't matter how well they perform, they're often not absorbed by the system. This should not be something difficult. South Africa is also, as a developing country, has also always indicated that they've got to focus, and they're focusing on ensuring that they capacitate SMMEs to be able to hire more and more young people. But whatever financial capacitation there seems to be talking about, it's not getting to the SMMEs who would actually be the ones that would lift the burden of youth unemployment within the countries. Like you've got companies such as, for example, MCA, and I have to say that because it is my company, that often have to struggle so much more harder to be able to keep and retain staff because there's not enough support also from the government. So there's no reason why. What I'm trying to say is that I think the government needs to stop making excuses about legislation having to be amended. You're talking about South African young people who are a ticking time bomb. We have seen in terms of infrastructure destruction the amount of damage that the youth can do if they're actually not being taken care of. The government should actually be prioritizing this. If it means that older people, the older generation needs to be encouraged to take their pension funds earlier so that there's more space, let that happen. Bottom line is that you are sitting with a situation where you as the government, whether it's within the private sector or the public sector, you are able to have an influence to make sure that these figures go down, and you're not doing anything.
What loopholes are in the government youth employment programs that are being said to not be enough to adequately deal with the problem?
The biggest one, obviously, speaks to the education, the quality and the standard of education that is not on par. That is the biggest loophole, because if somebody goes to school at St. Peter's and somebody goes to school in Motswagae, the level of education that they're getting is too different. And when they have to be presented for an employment opportunity, the person who comes from St. Peter is the one who's going to get the job. So the biggest problem right now is unfortunately the substandard or unlevel level of education between the private sector or private schooling and public schooling.
Yeah, very well. Thank you so much for your time. We're going to have to unfortunately leave it there for now. Lulu White speaking to the opportunities that need to be created for young people in South Africa, warning that the opportunities, should they be ignored, we could be facing a youth spring of discontent.